So here we go. A little less serious one, huh? The homily can be about whatever the priest or deacon wants to preach about that week. Yeah, right. I mean, sometimes people might think it might be in that, or there might be some homilies that fall into that idea, right? So, right, false. And the document has a little to say on it too. The ministry of preaching is to be fulfilled with exactitude and fidelity. Exactitude and fidelity. Well, right? I mean, don't worry. At least I'll speak for myself. Hold me accountable to what this says if you hear me preach. Exactitude and fidelity. The sermon, moreover, should draw its content mainly from scriptural and liturgical sources, and its character should be that of a proclamation of God's wonderful works in the history of salvation, the mystery of Christ, ever made present and active within us, especially in the celebration of the liturgy. That is the reality of preaching. That is what preaching should be encompassed by, embodied by, right? Yeah, please.
I was told that the homily was an explanation of the gospel, starting from the first reading and going on. A sermon is something that presider can preach about outside of the gospel. Is that accurate or not?
What I will say is I think in this context, in terms of what this translation says, I think that it's referring to the liturgical act of the homily in terms of the document. Now, in terms of liturgical action, I personally haven't heard that distinction myself between homily and sermon. Father, do you have any insight? Have you ever heard anything like that before?
Before the council, there was no such thing as a homily. There was only a sermon. So they're using the old language here, but they're referring to a homily. So in Mass, there can only be a homily. There is no sermon. A sermon can be on whatever you want, Paul, like you're saying, outside of Mass. Okay? Because there is no sermon in Mass.
All right. Hey, there we go. All right. Slam dunk, something teacher. That's great. Seriously. No, seriously. Like, ooh, I'm not about any of this, right? I mean, really, I appreciate it. So good. All right, awesome. Keep the questions coming. Don't be afraid to interrupt. I really do appreciate it. It's okay. Okay, good. So that's a little bit on the theology of the Mass, okay? Now we got some more practical stuff, right? Some practicals, all right? I can pray my rosary the entire Mass and actively participate. Yeah, like not what we were talking about in terms of this internal disposition, this active participation, right? Right? Not that reality, okay? So good, false. And don't worry too, I've been at funerals before where the celebrant's phone goes off, like during the homily or during the funeral homily, and then he took it out to turn it off, and then someone wrote a letter that he was texting during Mass. So it's geez, so don't worry, it happens all the time. So you're just like, oh man, yeah. So okay, all right. Vatican II said to get rid of all devotions. Have any of you ever heard like something like this said before about the Second Vatican Council? I mean, any ideas? I mean, it's kind of like hit and miss, right? But I've heard this thrown around that somehow these documents have referred to the reality that we shouldn't have devotions. Do you all know, like, is everyone familiar with the devotion, like Rosary, Divine Mercy Chaplet, little books that you can read or pray with, right? But they're private things, usually, or you can play the rosary publicly, of course, right? But, of course, that's false. Now, what I think people are thinking about is this reality of that you shouldn't be, like, praying the rosary or, like reading the bulletins, like, a little more frivolous in terms of, like, that's a negative thing. But some people might think of, like, okay, I'm going to pray the rosary, and that's something positive because I'm praying during the Mass. And it's like, well, what you really should be doing is engaging in what's happening, to listening to the readings, listening to the homily, actually praying with the celebrant in the Eucharistic prayer, to listen to the words, to actually pray during the petitions. I mean, to listen to them and pray for them. I mean, to think about that before. I mean, if the petition's too long, you kind of lose it, right? But there are these little things that we can grab onto in acts of prayer in the context of the Mass. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we can't ever pray devotions, right? These devotions should be so drawn up that they harmonize with liturgical seasons, accord with the sacred liturgy, and in some fashion derive from it, and lead the people to it. since in fact the liturgy by its very nature far surpasses any of them. So it's no secret that praying the rosary on your own, or praying the Divine Mercy Chaplet, or whatever devotion it is a great thing. But it doesn't surpass the need for us to go to Mass. That's what the church asks of us on holidays of obligation, on Sundays. And there's something to this communal action of celebrating and worshiping together. It's a similar answer as to why you just can't sit at home and read the Bible by yourself. That's certainly an admirable thing to do, but it can't replace this communal act of worship. If it's the foretaste of the heavenly kingdom, then it's something that we're going to be doing as a community in heaven. And so it wouldn't make sense then to worship just on your own by yourself, right? Here we go. This one is like the controversial one in the stack cards, right? Vatican II said Latin should not be used anymore in any liturgy. False, yeah. So have any of you ever heard, like, Second Vatican Council said this or that kind of thing, or I don't know, maybe, right? But it's false, right? So the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. So when I said this morning, someone mentioned, well, does that mean that like English Mass doesn't count or something? And I'm like, no. Like, this quote is saying that we should have some kind of heritage of our mother tongue, of Latin, preserved in some way in the liturgy, in the Mass. And if you actually look at that big book that the priest prays out of, the Roman Missal, it actually says in the little beginning section, it's called the General Instruction of the Roman Missal. It's kind of like the manual to the manual of celebrating Mass, right? It's that little section in the front. And it actually says in there that the people should be familiar with utilizing and praying in Latin in the Creed and in the Our Father. And particularly, those actions can be sung. So when was the last time any of you have ever been at a Mass, right, and heard the Creed or the Our Father in Latin, and for that matter, chanted, right? Like, yeah, I haven't heard that either. So, but it begs the question, like this document was looking to preserve some of those practices. The universal language of the church being Latin, we're remembering in the Creed that we're connected to all the community of believers around the world. No matter what language they speak, they have that universal tie of the Latin language. Now, granted, it hasn't really gone well in the implementation or the preservation of what some of the ideas were. And we can talk about that in the Q&A, but it's just a reminder that, you know, that the council didn't necessarily say to just get rid of all of the Latin in the context of the liturgy. Well, also, by the way, does anyone have any ideas of where else we use Latin that's more common today that you've heard? What's that? Particularly like maybe around Christmas, like the Gloria in Excelsis Deo, the Gloria, like, right? Or maybe like the Sanctus, the Holy, 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 that might be in Latin, or the Mystery of Faith, the Mystery of Fidelity, right? So that might be a little more familiar to us. All right, here we go. This is another good one. Most of the New Testament is not read at Mass. Most of the New Testament is not read at Mass, so it's not. There we go, good. So have you ever thought about before how much of the Scripture, how much of our Scriptures in terms of Old Testament and New Testament is used at the Mass today? Well, here's a little document quote about the importance of Scripture in the Mass and some of the motivation for why the lectionary had to be changed, why the readings are the way they are, had to be changed, and I'll show you why. Here we go. So, the pre-Vatican II to the current, so pre-Vatican II, like pre-1960s, right? In the Old Testament, we would hear, in that context of that time frame, 255 verses. Compared to now, on Sundays and major feasts, we hear over 3,000 verses of the Old Testament in the context of Sundays and major feast days. Now, if you look at, though, this number decreased from like the 40s into 1951 when there was another reform. On major feast days and Sundays, you only heard 98 verses of the Old Testament. In other words, the Old Testament wasn't used very much in the context of the Mass, right? Then for the New Testament, what our question was about, pre-Vatican II, we're looking at about 1,300 verses of the New Testament. So now we hear over 70% of the New Testament in the context of Sundays and major feast days. So what that means for us is that the lectionary that exists now was not always the way it is. So now we have the 3-year cycle, year A, year B, year C. We go through all the Gospels, right? All the 4 Gospel writers in the context of those Sundays. We hear the Old Testament. We also hear letters from St. Paul. And of course, it goes without saying too, this is not including the Psalms. Because the responsorial psalm is a huge portion of the liturgy before the council and after the council. That's one thing that's remained the same, unchanged. But in any case, we have to remember though, that in that 3-year cycle, we're hearing all the Gospels. Then during the week, there's year 1 and year 2. If you're ever a lector at daily mass, I did this. I think I was at a parish where we were reading the wrong daily mass readings for like several months. Because so it was like, oh man, oh. So, but what's important is that if we're in an odd year, then we're in year 1. If we're in an even year, then we're in year 2. That's kind of like the cheat that you can use. So you look at the spine, you're like, oh, we're not reading the right year, right? So yeah, look at that. It's like, man, that's why the homily's been kind of off. Like, Father, we were preparing this, and we've been reading this, it just kind of works out, okay? So, here we go. Vatican II said that confession is not that important. And I don't know, this might not be as common as a myth that some people have heard, but I've heard it thrown around by some people in some parishes I've been at, and not necessarily just in our diocese. But I've heard this claim that confession isn't something that's as emphasized anymore after the Second Vatican Council. And I'll tell you, if you looked at the guys in the room, the bishops in the room that wrote these documents, they're like, what? Like, we didn't say that. We didn't write that. That's not in the catechism. Like, we didn't say that. So, of course, false. So still, once a year, we still need to perform penance after, right? And also we need to be sorry. And there's a little tidbit, too, about the reality that there are still some sins that can only be forgiven by the bishop, and there are still some sins that can only be forgiven by the Pope. Now, granted, I don't think any of us would ever find ourselves in the position of the Pope, for example, to need to go to the Pope for a reconciliation. One of them is if the priest breaks the seal of confession, then he's automatically excommunicated and needs to be reconciled by the Holy See in order to be forgiven and brought back into the church after that. So, like, we're good there, right? We don't need to worry about that. But in another context that's a little more recent is, for example, the sin of helping someone procure or receiving an abortion, for example. That used to be something that was reserved for the bishop to forgive. And then even as recent as the Year of Mercy, Pope Francis extended that ability to even SSPX priests. And we can talk about SSPX and what that is and why that is, but not the focus. But in any case, what I want to say is that that ability to forgive that sin has been extended far more than what it was once. So in that sense, things have been changing since the Second Vatican Council.